Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today's program is going to be quite unusual. It is a tribute to one of my heroes, Stanley Krippner, one of the individuals who inspired me to pursue a career in parapsychology when I first met him 50 years ago. Now, Stanley is still active. He'll be 87 years old next month, and he's still teaching and writing and speaking. But Stanley is truly a hero to virtually everybody who knows him. And I've been given some archival footage of people, many of whom are long departed, who have worked with Stanley over the years and who are going to comment now about how his work has influenced them. This first tribute is from one of my other intellectual heroes, Dr. Charles Tart, who is also, as a matter of fact, one of my dissertation supervisors when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and he was part of the University of California system. Back in those days, as I recall, in Berkeley, it seemed as if it was almost mandatory for everybody on the Berkeley campus and probably everybody in the city of Berkeley to be carrying a copy of Charlie's anthology, Altered States of Consciousness. It was just everywhere. And now we'll switch over to the archival video.
Well, I don't know how Stan characterizes himself on this issue, actually, but I would think of Stan as primarily a transpersonal psychologist with an awful lot of work in parapsychology kind of things, because he's interested in the big pictures, the nature of consciousness, what spiritual experiences are. And so I think we're actually very similar in that sense. Now, I use an analogy sometimes to compare the fields. Parapsychology is to transpersonal psychology like physics is to engineering. Okay? Physics is a fundamental study of the very basic properties of the world. Engineering is using those properties to do things with them. Okay, parapsychology asks some very basic questions about what a human mind can do, like can it reach out telepathically or clairvoyantly or something like that. Transpersonal psychology, as it presently exists, is more interested in what you can then do to use these expanded kind of capacities of the human mind. So I find the two fields go very well together. You know, the parapsychology tends to be more technical, but the transpersonal psychology is really about soul. I first met Stan sometime in the late 1960s. And Montague Ullman, who was the head of the Maimonides Project, introduced Stan to me at one of the annual Sleep and Dream conferences. By that time, for about 5 or 6 years, there had been an international conference each year of people doing sleep and dream research. And this was very exciting to me. That was my main research interest at the time. So Monty introduced me to Stan, and, you know, we got a little bit acquainted and hit it off. And that was all that contact for about a year or two. And then I ran into Stan and Monty again at another one of these dream conferences a couple of years later. And this was actually very interesting, because this was the first time that they presented reports on their telepathic dream studies at Maimonides to the general sleep and dream research community. And they did a fantastic job. They had very striking results. The methodology was very good. They left people in the conference abuzz with, what was this? How this could be, and yet, and I could, to illustrate just how stimulated people were, It was the last day of the conference they presented, and that afternoon I ended up on a plane back to California with a young psychiatrist who'd come to the conference because he was getting started in dream research. And we started talking about Stan and Monty's presentation, and this psychiatrist didn't know I was a weirdo like a parapsychologist. He just thought I was an ordinary psychologist, sleep and dream researcher. And so we would talk about various aspects of the presentation, and I would mention some other studies occasionally that supported it. By the time we were halfway across the country, this psychiatrist got into this behavior pattern where about every 15 minutes he'd suddenly turn to me and say, either you're really crazy or I've really been missing out on something. You go back to either you're really crazy or I've really been missing out on something. They had a tremendous impact in presenting that material. And Stan was especially good in his presentation because he can do a style of presentation where he can say the most outrageous things by conventional standards in this very calm, unexcited voice, so it sort of slips deep in people before they realize, hey, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to believe that. Yeah, well, this community was sleep and dream researchers, most of whom, knew nothing about parapsychology. And I don't think the word transpersonal psychology was even in circulation yet, and so forth. So this was, very exciting because they had such good data. And then, of course, Stan and I have been in regular contact for 30 or 40 years since then.
The next tribute to Stan Krippner comes from Deirdre Barrett, who at the time of this recording, back in about 2004, was a professor of psychology at Harvard University, as well as editor of Dreaming, the journal of the International Association for the Study of Dreams.
I tend to know Stan for his Western psychology dream research. He's published in the journal Dreaming that I edit, and I've published in his books on dreams. And at the conventions I go to the most, he's often presenting dream content analysis and Western things, parapsychology from a Western point of view. So I just loved it when I met this cross-cultural psychologist named Amaro Laria, who looks mainly at shamanism and other cultures. And as soon as he found out that I knew Stan, he really lit up and said, God, everybody knows Stan Krippner. And he told me that Amaro had traveled on a trip to South America to interview this curandero that he'd heard of through very native channels way up in the Andes, and he hiked for days and days with these native clues about how to get there. And of course Amaro speaks all of the native languages, so he finally arrives in this little village and is introduced to the curandero and says he's from the United States. And immediately the curandero says, you know Stanley Krippner? And he said that then almost 2 years later, he was in Africa searching out this herbal healing doctor that he'd heard of from one of his studies, and tromping through the wilds of Africa for days. And he gets to the herbalist and again tells him about the research he wants to do. And when he says he's from the United States, it's, do you know Stanley Krippner? And on an Asian trip to Nepal to visit a Qigong master, he climbs up into the Himalayas to this remote monastic place that very few Westerners have been, and again says the other things, and when he says he's an American, it's, you know Stanley Krippner. So Amaro had actually never met Stanley Krippner, but was telling me this as soon as he learned that I did, which is a whole other side of Stan than the Western meetings that I tend to be at with him.
Our next tribute to Stan Krippner comes from Albert Ellis, who at the time of this recording was probably the most famous psychologist in the United States. Al was the founder of Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, and I've had the privilege of interviewing him for the original Thinking Aloud series.
I first met Stan, I think in the 1960s, when he was doing rational emotive therapy, and I corresponded with him. I don't remember whether I probably met him at meetings, but he was somewhere, I think, in the Midwest, and I corresponded with him, and then later met him. the people at the university wanted to give a workshop, a 3-day, I think it was, workshop, with Stanley doing his thing and I doing rational emotive behavior therapy. And I think we gave the many people that attended primary training certificates in rational emotive behavior therapy. We show people that they have both rational and irrational ideas, and that the rational beliefs are preferences. I would like to do well and be loved by significant others, but then they add to them, and therefore I have to, I must, and I'm no good if I don't do as I must, and the world's a horrible place and I can't stand it if other people don't love me. Well, he is a humanist, and we are, and I am a humanist, and therefore we both go for human rights and are activists. And I've been a human activist even before I was a psychologist, way back to the age of 18 and 19. And in the psychological field, as I said today at the American Psychological Association meetings in Chicago, I push, and help people unconditionally accept themselves, no matter what they do, but also unconditionally accept others, which is completely against prejudice, bigotry, labeling of all kinds. And therefore we, as Stanley too does, goes for equal women's rights, against racism, against all kinds of fascistic, anti-humanistic philosophies.
Our next tribute comes from yet another of my intellectual heroes, Jean Houston, the author of more than a dozen books, probably closer to 24, on human potential. Jean also founded Jean Houston's Mystery School, of which I proudly and gladly participated. I can say this honestly, Jean Houston has been one of the biggest influences in my own intellectual life and career development.
Well, I met him probably as early as 1962, and it probably was a conference or a small meeting on those of us who were studying psychedelic effects of LSD on human personality. And when I was very young, I was about 20, I had the only legal supply of LSD in New York City. I was very popular, and I met all kinds of people, and one of them was Stan. In those days, he looked like a young Van Johnson. I'll remember that, yeah. And so we got to be good friends, and then within a year I was engaged to my husband, Robert Masters, and we traveled many of the same paths together. And so I remember in 66, my husband and I were married in 65, and then we created a foundation for mind research to do non-drug studies of human capacities. And of course, Stan had already switched to that area and was doing all manner of fascinating studies in consciousness research, dream research, parapsychology, and we joined each other in a number of experiments at that time. Well, Stanley Krippner was, in many ways, one of the modern pioneers in the exploration, not just of human capacities and the whole range of human potentials, but also anomalous experiences. In other words, what he has done over so many years is push the membrane on the possible and help to explore the huge variety of who and what we are and what we yet can be. And by looking at the anomalous experiences, one finds one discovers a great deal more about the human condition and the breadth and range of our capacity. So when he is looking at parapsychological experiences or experiences of unusual states of consciousness or experiences that people can discover within themselves in sports or love or rapture or high creativity, what Stanley is helping to do is to expand the spectrum of the human condition. And as I say, he's been a master at this for many, many years. Einstein once said that the consciousness that created the problem cannot be the same consciousness that solves it. And I think the kinds of work that Stanley Krippner has done has really shown us how to engage a consciousness that is rich enough, deep enough, has enough variety, spice, complexity to deal with this most critical time in human history. I realize other times in history thought they were it, they're wrong, this is it. I mean, this is simply the most important time in human history. And what we do with our consciousness, our minds, our ways of relating to each other, our ways of relating to the earth, to nature, to spirit, will make the difference as to whether we grow or whether we die.
Our next tribute comes from Robert Masters, of Jean Houston's husband, of course, and co-author with her of Varieties of Psychedelic Experience. Dr. Masters has written a number of other books and, in addition, developed the Masters method of mind-body integration.
I first met Stan Krippner in the early to mid-1960s. I was doing psychedelic drug research, and he was very interested in that. And I was director of the Library of Sex Research in New York City, and I was doing work with transsexuals and making psychological evaluations for sex change operations, and he was very interested in that. And I was working with an old doctor, Harry Benjamin, who pioneered that kind of work and coined the word transsexual, and Stanley knew him, and the three of us used to get together from time to time. And then later, after Jean and I were married and we created the Foundation for Mind Research, we had various devices there to alter consciousness, and we were trying to recreate the psychedelic experience without drugs. We had a sensory overload chamber and something called the Witch's Cradle, and he was in charge of the sleep and dream laboratory at Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn. They were doing all these telepathy experiments in dreams. And so people in our lab would, say, be in the sensory overload chamber and be completely enveloped with images that were thematic, say, wild animals or birth of a baby. And when someone started to dream at Maimonides in Brooklyn, as they could tell by the rapid eye movements, then we would start this program, and the person who was in the chamber would try to send the images to the person who was sleeping in Brooklyn. And that was evaluated as unusually successful for dream telepathy experiments. And it worked best if the people were lovers or emotionally bonded. We had something called a witch's cradle that was a device that a person would stand in. They were had straps around them so that they wouldn't fall out of the thing, and it was suspended from a long, very sensitive rope. And in this device, people would go into trance, and then the images they had would generate micro movements of the muscles, and that would keep the thing going back and forth and back and forth. And we loaned them a copy at Maimonides, and they did some experiments with it, and they also had better telepathy results than they had with all of their normal procedures. Well, at the time that Stanley put his energies into parapsychology, that was a risky thing for a psychologist to do. He had a lot invested in his doctorate in psychology and in a possible academic career and so on, and when he plunged into parapsychology, he risked his reputation, and you can get attacked on all sides when you're doing that. He could get it from somebody like the amazing Randy, who's trying to debunk the whole thing, or you can get it from orthodox psychologists who think that you're disgracing the profession. At that time, psychology was all in the hands of B.F. Skinner and the rat psychologists, and they especially were antagonistic to that sort of thing. He was much too free for them. in addition to parapsychology, he had a strong interest in creativity and creative process. And so he was interested in altered states, both trance and drugs, and all of these were, a little bit dubious from the, certainly the standpoint of the behaviors.
Our next guest is Dr. Ilene Serlin. She is a dance therapist and former president of Division 32, the Division of Humanistic Psychology of the American Psychological Association.
Here's a couple of memories that stand out. When we were in Moscow, and this was 1991, just after the wall fell, it was really exciting. There was a celebration in Red Square. There was a big cultural event, and Stanley had already got tickets. I sat next to him. The ballerina Maya Pliskaya came out of retirement to do The Dying Swan there in Red Square in front of a whole audience and a backdrop of the cathedral. Stanley knew all the ballet. He may have even known her personally. He knew all about her. He knows about theater. I've seen Stanley dash off poems for occasions. They're funny. He used to be an MC at a lot of student things, has jokes. I've seen him sit down at the piano and play the piano. So these are all sides of Stanley that he'll never talk about, and many people don't know about. I think, so the other thing that occurred to me as I was thinking about that is that most people think of Stanley as a scientist. And I got curious about, and I just had another memory of being with him in Russia, and we happened to be at a cathedral right when a mass was going on, and it was gorgeous. It was one of these Russian Orthodox with lots of candles. It was a dark, all gold and painted cathedral. It was a very sacred, very special moment, kind of very silent, filled with people on their knees, ladies in black, and a kind of non-ordinary event. And I saw that Stanley seemed to be as absorbed as the rest of us in this. But when we came out into the sunshine, he was kind of Stanley again. And I said, Stanley, where's the scientist part of you? Are you caught up in the religious moment, or are you in the religious moment as a scientist, thinking about it, analyzing it at the same time? Because he's a skeptic. He has a unique ability, I think, to be immersed in non-ordinary states, and at the same time, it's not at the same time, he's not skeptical about it then, but it's not like he becomes afterward, he does become the scientist in terms of thinking about it, but it doesn't mean he rules it out either. Somehow a very unique ability to sort of suspend judgment while he's in it, to be respectful and fully participatory, but then afterward he may say, it's not that he believed in it, or something actually swayed his thinking and now he's a believer. So he doesn't go to the other side of faith. Anyway, that unique combination of being both a scientist and a participant, and the same thing with a scientist and surprising artistic ability, is something that I think is very unique about Stanley.
Etzel Cardena has recently been interviewed on the New Thinking Aloud channel. He's going to give our next tribute. He is the author and editor, actually, really editor of several important anthologies in parapsychology and in anomalous psychology. He is also the editor of the Journal of Parapsychology.
I met Stan personally about 20 years ago. I was a graduate student at the University of California, Davis, and Davis is just north of San Francisco. And I just contacted him. I was working with Charles Tart, who is a friend of Stan and a colleague, and I noticed immediately the generosity of Stan, because I was a completely unknown graduate student, called him to see if we could chat. So I knew about his work beforehand. I knew about his work on dream telepathy, on altered states of consciousness, which is the area that I was working with Charles Tart. So I contacted him, asked whether we could meet, have a drink or so, and he said immediately yes, gave me a lot of his time, gave me guidance, advice, and he has continued doing that. Sometimes when I go to another country, if I don't have contacts either with shamans or other professionals, oftentimes I will ask Stan if he knows someone, and typically the answer is yes, he does, and he will graciously pass me the word of the people that I should be talking to. Well, the only collaboration I have had with Stan was editing a book. It is called Varieties of Anomalous Experience. Stephen J. Ilene is the other co-editor. And I was first approached by Stephen J. Ilene, who is the editor of a series for the American Psychological Association, APA, and he asked me what would I like to do. At that point I said, well, Charles Tart, my mentor, had edited a book called Altered States of Consciousness in the 60s, early 70s, and I thought that was by far the best book on the area. I had gone to UC Davis to study with Charles Tart because of it, but it was dated by now. And I thought, well, I would like to update what Charles Tart did a number of years ago, what Stan Krippner as well had done in his books on altered states some years ago. I would like to find out at this point in time, what can psychologists say about anomalous experiences, which by that we mean experiences that are not usual, are uncommon, are rare, but are not pathological, are not necessarily pathological. So when we talk about something like synesthesia, that is individuals who ordinarily are able to see colors when they hear a specific sound, or they may see geometric shapes when they taste food, etc., we're talking about something that is extraordinarily rare, but it is not pathological per se, or when somebody has a mystical experience. So I was approached, and I said, well, I would like to do this. Stanley Krippner was around, and I asked him, would you like to be part of this endeavor with Stephen J. Ilene? And so we had, I think, a great troika, if you will, of people, all of whom brought something slightly different to the book, but we were both very hard-nosed as far as trying to get very reliable, concrete, solid evidence of what can psychologists say about fascinating, unusual experiences that can change an individual's life.
Our next tribute comes from Professor Mike Arons. I remember serving with him on the board of the Association for Humanistic Psychology. He really established the parapsychology program at West Georgia College. Now it's the university. And they're still teaching parapsychology there. If you wanted to get a graduate degree and do a parapsychological dissertation in the United States, that would be the place to go.
In our department, we were doing some research on psychedelics to see the effects of it. And the Canadian government at that point was trying to put on the same kind of restrictions as the Americans had done. I'm an American. I just happened to have gone up there to teach. And so we're very concerned about that because those restrictions were pretty much precluding any kind of effective research. So I put out a notice that there was going to be a hearing, and I sent it around the United States to various individuals, and Stanley was one of them, to come and help because we were going to present a white paper at the Canadian Senate. Asking them not to preclude research in the legislation that they passed. And so he came to Canada for that Senate meeting, and that was where I first met him. Well, my original and really continuing interest has been in creativity. And of course, Stanley was very much interested in that area as well. He was working in that area back with what we now is called special education. Stanley, some of his earliest interests were in special education, and special education encompasses that which is sort of divergent from normalcy, including retardation and creativity. Again, I became very interested in Stanley because he at that time was working in fact, he was the director of the Maimonides Dream Laboratory in New York, and he was teaching at Wagner University or Wagner College in Long Island. And we were very much interested in teaching courses that were different from the kinds of psychology courses. We had started a humanistic and what became transpersonal program back there in 1967. So we had invited people like Robert Morris, who had been working in that sort of thing. He's now, I believe, in Scotland. And Robert gave a talk there, and Stanley gave a talk there. And then I went to Wagner, and I met Stanley at Wagner at one point or another. We became rather close in our interests, of course. And he was part of the opening of the whole humanistic psychology movement. The organizations that at that time was called the Association for Humanistic Psychology. The American Association for they dropped the American when they tried to make it more international. And when I then moved, I became chairman of the Department of Psychology at what is now called State University of West Georgia. At that time it was West Georgia College. I invited Robert Morris and Stan Krippner to come and give talks there. And Stanley came, and his typical way and his great generosity, he went from place to place and gave talks, and the students would come, and they were just absolutely amazed by it. And I think he gave, I forget, I'm just giving you a nominal number here. Let's say he gave like 9 talks during the day, during the period he was there. Well, then Robert Morris came, and I asked him to come and give a talk. And he said, and I told him that Stanley had been there. And so he said, how did his talk go? I said, which one? He said, what do you mean? I said, he gave 9. He says, okay, count on me for 10. So then Robert Morris gave 10 talks. And after that, I invited Stanley back every single year. Stanley became a tradition at West Georgia. Everybody looked forward to him. Usually he would come in January, February, somewhere in that area. And that was over a 30-year period. Stanley would come, and he was just, he'd come because every time he would report on his recent odyssey, wherever he had gone. And then we had gone to many meetings together. We had gone on trips around the world together. Like in 1972, we went to, started out in France, and we were giving lectures, all of us, the whole group, humanistic psychologists, Kami Harari and Stanley Graham and Stanley and a whole bunch of them. And we gave talks in France and in Iran and in Russia, and then in Japan and Thailand and so on and so forth. And Stanley was right there with all of this. In fact, when we went to Russia there was a big parapsychology conference that Stanley had helped to arrange because he was quite familiar with the Russian parapsychologists. And so here we already have talked about 3 things that Stanley has been interested in. That is the psychedelic research. He was interested in the special education, it being published in all of these things. By the way, at the time that I brought Stanley, this is 1967, to Prince Edward, to what is now University of Prince Edward Island, Prince of Wales College, he already had, I believe, 14 full pages on his Vita sheet. That was in 1967. 1967 of writings, books, and so on and so forth. I'd never met a man as prolific, and in all of these different areas, of which I've just mentioned like 4.
Patty Westerbeke is a dear friend. As a matter of fact, the Westerbeke ranch that she was running at the time of this interview is where I got married to my wife, Janelle, and it served as sort of a second Esalen Institute, the Esalen north of San Francisco. It was a center for all sorts of human potential activities, and Patty was right at the heart of it.
Hi, I'm Patty Westerbeke. This is my daughter, Susan.
Hello.
And we live and run the Westerbeke Ranch. And one time Stanley Krippner lived here for maybe almost a year with a few of his colleagues. And he came and he first brought Rolling Thunder to kind of psych the place out. And so we burnt, fresh tobacco and a little ceremony
Sage.
over on the, what?
Sage,
yes.
To heal our Indian mouths.
And then, and he was always a very fascinating person. And later on in our life together. He said, Patty, you ought to really go into, you ought to get a degree in what you know. And we have been very involved with psychic surgery in the Philippines. And my husband had a pituitary tumor that was growing. And so I took Stanley up on it, and we did some very interesting, going back and forth on the airplane with pilgrims that were going to see all the different healers in the Philippines. I was able to hand out a questionnaire, and we did this about 4 or 5 times, and maybe 100 people signed, voluntarily gave information about their lifestyles, and what was, it was like, how do you,
when healing happens.
What has to happen for healing to take place. And then on the way home from seeing the healers, they were given another set of papers, and so Stanley helped me with that. And then he took the information and had someone do the statistics and the
research.
The research, yeah. And then he gave this paper as a presentation at The Hague one year. He's a lovely man who had such a great, sincere, and deep interest in whoever he was teaching. He's truly a teacher. And I've seen him right on this deck with a student in the middle of deep conversation on the student subject. And then it just happened a year later at the same time, the same student, the same deck. And he would just pick up exactly where the conversation. I just happened to be a listener in on that. And I realized, my goodness, his mind is so brilliant and so quick, and he's so generous with himself. He's a charming man. I just recently went to Brazil, and I didn't know the first thing about not voodoo, but candomblé or Umbanda or Kardechism. And I stayed at a really holy mistress of the Orixa in Sao Paulo, my sister. And a lot of magic things happened. And before I went, he gave me these 2 marvelous papers that just told me exactly what I needed to know before going down there. And so I've seen him through the years. And, I remember when he was going to Russia and doing experiments with all sorts of different,
Carillion photographers.
Carillion photography and psychokinesis and he said, well, there are all these things magical things that you can do, and there's reasons, you can find out reasons of doing them. But when it comes right down to it, you can pick up a phone and talk to somebody, or you can move an object from one part of the table to the other. But what we really think is the most powerful gift in this sort of, it's not nether science, is healing. How people are healed and what their mental state has to be, and their beliefs about getting themselves well. And sometimes illness serves a great purpose in a person's life. But anyway, so you have to get that straight.
Professor Theresa McIntyre, who provides our next tribute, co-edited an anthology with Stan Krippner on the effects of war trauma upon civilians internationally.
Okay, I'm Theresa McIntyre. I'm a professor of health psychology at the University of Minho in Portugal. I've been there for the last 10 years, and previously I was in the US getting my graduate education. Yes, we actually met in Portugal when I organized the first hypnosis conference. From a scientific perspective, hypnosis was considered more or less as a folk phenomena in Portugal, and is not very respected. And so and I had hypnosis training with Erica Fromm and Daniel Brown here in the US, and became very interested in working with hypnosis and health problems, and also with trauma. And so when we organized the hypnosis conference, Stanley was a person that was very important in motivating us to go forward with this project, and also with creating the Portuguese Society of Experimental and Scientific Hypnosis. And so that's how I met him. He came to Portugal to do a workshop in hypnosis and to participate in the conference and to try to disseminate a scientific view on hypnosis in Portugal. Since I was in the US, I worked with immigrant populations in Boston, And I was very interested in the interface between trauma, health, immigration, and the impact of trauma in civilians. And when I went to Portugal and I met Stan, it kind of, our interests kind of crossed. And so we started talking about what I was doing, and meanwhile I had developed a relationship with an Angolan psychologist and was doing research in Angola on the impact of war trauma on adolescents, Angolan adolescents. Because Angola is a very interesting scenario for research because these adolescents have lived all their lives in war. So they've been exposed to war. They don't know anything else but the war experience. So it's very interesting from a kind of scientific point of view to see how different degrees of war exposure would affect the development of these adolescents, especially consider that in Angola has a high percentage of youth, and these youth are going to be the leaders and the workers for Angolan's future. So I developed this relationship with this Angolan psychologist, and since more or less 1993, I started studying the impact of war trauma on these Angolan adolescents, and even while the war was still going on. And then I published 2 reports on the Psychologist International on these studies, and Stan became very interested in this research. And then we thought about organizing for APA, for one of the APA conferences, symposium on the impact of war in general on civilians and so forth. And that had a lot of success. That symposium had a big audience and generated a lot of interest. And then in one of those meetings, we started discussing, and I always thought that there was a lot of stuff published on the impact of war on war veterans, but not a lot on civilians. And in Europe, of course, with the war scenario in Yugoslavia and Croatia and so forth, we started hearing a lot in the news about the displacement of civilian populations, and I was also aware through my work in Angola that many times the NGOs do not pay too much attention to mental health needs. They pay a lot of attention to more physical needs, immediate physical needs, nutrition and so forth, first aid stuff, but not to the mental health of these populations. So, I thought it was very pertinent to write something on the impact of war trauma on civilians. And we both had contacts in different countries and knew different authors, so we could get a wide range of perspectives and also of experiences. And actually, the first section in our book is on case histories. It's almost like case studies where different authors describe war trauma in different countries and different continents. So that's how the book came about.
This final tribute comes from one of my favorite people, Jean Millay. Jean is really wonderful. She was at one time married to the famous tabla player, Ala Raka. That will become significant in a future video I plan to release, where we see that Jean's connection with Ala Raka actually resulted in Stanley Krippner's close connection with Mickey Hart and the Grateful Dead. In addition, she is the editor of a marvelous anthology called Silver Threads, reports from the Parapsychology Research Group in San Francisco. I've written the foreword to the newest edition of that book. But Jean combines within her person both scientific and mediumistic capabilities. In addition, I can tell you this for viewers who have watched the very advanced videos on hyperspace and string theory and physics and consciousness with Saul Paul Sarag. I remember the years in which Jean and Saul Paul were housemates in San Francisco.
In 1963, I had read Aldous Huxley about the colors, the extra colors in the rainbow, and I was teaching art, and I wanted to know about them, and I had an opportunity to have a peyote experience. Well, I saw color. I learned about auras. I learned about all kinds of, because you can see people interacting with this light energy going between them. And after that, and some LSD in the 60s before it was illegal, the number of psychic experiences increased enormously. So I wanted to know more about it. And I had to know more about it. As a matter of fact, one of my sisters said, you know, you're getting weird. So I volunteered for Dr. Barbara Brown at the Veterans Hospital in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time. She was looking for volunteers for brainwave biofeedback, which had been developed by Joe Camilla originally. And so I went down there, and sure enough, I can control my brainwaves. So I said, well, okay, I'm not going crazy, you know. And then I was in New York in 1967, winter of 67, 68. And I noticed that there was a class in ESP. I don't use that term myself anymore, but because it means extrasensory. And our own senses are really enough. You just have to let them expand out. But there were several different lecturers at that conference, and one of them was Dr. Stanley Krippner talking about his work at the Dream Lab. Well, I was so impressed. I asked, it was close to New York, I asked him if I could go by and see what he was doing. And of course, Stanley, he's so generous with his time and sharing and so on, and he let me come by. And eventually I was a subject for some of the work that he did. But at that time, most of the work was from the Rhine Lab, or, you know, where they're looking at cards. Well, the statistics in the cards were material enough to allow some people to pay attention to it. But of course, the worst thing in the world is to try to guess cards, because you know them all and you can remember them all. They're in your memory. The best way to do telepathy is to reach out for something you don't know. And Stanley, in the dreams, Stanley would hook up our brainwaves and plug us into the wall and put us to sleep there. And then in the other room, he had the chart recordings so he could tell when we were dreaming. And then he would have someone in another room of the Maimonides Hospital Medical Center, or across town. One time it was Gene Houston over in New York, doing a whole multimedia thing to try to affect my dreams. Well, actually that worked out very well. My first two dreams were involved, you know, in my own personal dynamic. It was part of the message wrapped into mine. And at that time, they were doing a whole build-up on the moon landing. So the first one, they're orbiting the moon. In my dream, I'm just going around in circles, and I don't know well how my life is going. I'm going around in circles. And in another one where they landed on the moon, I had a dream about my nephew out in the ranch saying, oh boy, crazy, Aunt Jeannie's really crazy now. Where she's living, there's only land when the tide goes out. It looked like, you know. So the final dream, I actually saw the television screen, which I had seen with, you know, Nixon's picture in the corner and a guy with a flag on his shoulder, you know, and so I knew exactly what it was. So in the morning, Stanley Krippner shows us a bunch of pictures, still pictures, and you're supposed to say, pick out the right one. Well, I was, of course, easily able to do that, even though what he showed me was not my dream. He showed me something else about the moon, about the Apollo program. And so it was very clear, and he was doing the most wonderful work then, because it really involved consciousness. It wasn't just card guessing. It was the whole thing. And I was enormously impressed. And I wanted to know what he was doing, and I wasn't in New York long, but he answers mail. You know, he gets 100 pieces of mail and he answers it all. And I was amazed that I could write to him and he would respond. I'm in Los Angeles by then. And so when he became the master teacher for Saybrook, I'm ready to study with him.